That was a wonderful introduction from Carol. Basically, I just want to start off by saying over several years of research or study, I've been mostly based in the United Kingdom, but also various other places in Europe and North America. That's going to be the focus of my talk for primarily geographic regions. That's where I'm most familiar with the hobby and the wild situation. And I'm going to relate it back to America and Central America in particular, where has been my study focus. I've been associated with the Natural History Museum in London, and then afterwards for many years with Oxford University Museum of Natural History. I want to say, as full disclosure, I'm associated with the British Tarantula Society, which is basically a hobby-led organisation. I've been the treasurer of the society for several years, so I have close connections with the hobby, and I see many benefits of a hobby. So it's going to be a tough talk for me to try and find some balance between issues of sustainability, legalities, and also hobby benefits, I would say. So let's hurry up. To introduce tarantulas, because it's the first tarantula talk, or terrestrial invertebrates, I think. And I think many of you are familiar with what tarantulas are, but I also feel it needs some introduction. And basically to say they're large spiders with thick bodies and hairy legs primarily. That's a loose definition, but more technically, the spider family Theraphostae. So a few examples here. Realistically, they're mostly kind of brown and quite dull looking, I'm afraid to say. So a lot of people either dislike spiders or even despise them. That's a struggle many people who like such animals have to convey with a wider audience. So these aren't the most beautiful and fascinating ones. You can see in the lower left side, if my cursor works, hopefully, this one here has some markings on the legs. We can say there are more attractive species. Hopefully some of you can agree at least. This is a more attractive species over here on the right. This one's a Mexican tarantula. They're all different species of Mexican tarantulas here, which I've photographed in the wild. Many of you might not be aware, though, there are a lot of species. It's difficult to say what a lot of species are. It depends on what group of organisms you're interested into, what's a lot, what's a few. But down at the bottom here, we have diversity. So tarantulas, as the family Theraphostae, are about 151 genera, 1,000 or so described species at the moment. But there's plenty of undescribed species. I would say the number of described species is going to fall slightly as we have some taxonomic changes, but not so much. There are still plenty of others to describe. The number of tarantula species, I think, is going to increase substantially. Okay, and so what's the appeal? There is a large pet trade community which is involved in keeping and even breeding tarantulas as pets. A lot of exchange going on. Some are arguably very beautiful animals. This is just a picture which I've taken as a screenshot from Google. And that shows some of the pictures that various people have shared online, and unfortunately, credit to them, these aren't my pictures. But then hopefully, I have a technical issue. Sorry, thought that might be a problem.
It's not working. Ooh. Oh yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop touching buttons now. That was the next thing I want to show is the tarantula community as a whole. So the lower left image is a picture of an annual exhibition in the United Kingdom. I say exhibition, but it's really a trade event where several thousand people attend an annual event. And you can see the scale of the trade going on. So not only are animals available for sale there, but also lots of other paraphernalia, I'd call it, enclosures, books, toys, key rings, you name it, anything associated with them that might be of an appeal to a hobbyist or a keeper of spiders. And there's also plenty of people who attend who don't like spiders and go to just see the weird and wonderful. Bottom right is an equivalent trade show in Germany. One of the German organizations has two main events per year, similar sort of scale. I'd also say that in both those countries and several other European countries and North America, there's smaller events, I'd say, throughout the year. So these are just the big main events for each country of the year. Okay, so the presentation is still working, I think. The top right then, just to show you a picture of some of the spiders for sale. Many of you, I think, will imagine tarantulas being large, visible tarantula spiders. What you imagine a tarantula is a big spider. Most of them aren't. Most are quite small species in general, even as adults. But the trade primarily in these events goes on with young or juveniles of the animals. So in each one of those boxes there are at least 9 young, recently hatched spiders, maybe 18, maybe 27, depending on how they're boxing. Sometimes the sellers can sell a large number and then also replace that number. So the display might not be what they're actually physically selling, but just be aware they can sell large numbers of very small spiders. And also just associated with that are various events that go on. So these shows generally have lectures, and the great thing for the UK one is we have competitions as well. So some of the hobbyists can bring in their own spiders from their own collections and compare them against each other. It gets some rivalry, but friendly rivalry, and that often gets great publicity, particularly from local news and media, about the equivalent of a pet competition for who's got the best spider. So it has a positive public feel as well. Okay, I need to hurry up here, but basically to say although the tarantulas are naturally found all across the world. So this is just a picture from one of the Wikipedia pages which alleges to show the world distribution of tarantulas. In light green there is supposedly the distribution of tarantulas across the world. It's pretty wrong, to be honest, but it's a good basis for a starter. Here's a map overlay then of some actual observation data which has been recorded as being tarantulas from iNaturalist, which is I'd say a very good website where different people around the world can share their observations of creatures they found generally in nature. So those are really showing tarantulas that people have found in nature in the Americas. I'll just draw your attention, if the arrow does work, this region of North America east of the Mississippi River actually doesn't have any native tarantulas in, even though there are some introduced into southern Florida. The map's also wrong, particularly in Spain. There's one species of native tarantula that goes right into the southern parts of Spain, but not much further north. Saharan Africa, I think you can guess that there's probably not that many tarantulas in a very, very dry zone with pure desert as we might imagine the Sahara. China's wrong also. They're only in the southern part of China and a little into the Himalayas. And Western Australia is also wrong. There's no tarantulas in that region. But essentially, it's showing a worldwide distribution. What I want to emphasize is, if my machine is working again, no, it's playing up. 1 second.
No, wait.
Okay, I've tried to put a few graphical here. I might restart it in a second. What I want to show you though is where the major trade patterns are. And I'm hoping, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to stop sharing and restart if you don't mind. We got away the first time, but not the second.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Right, seems a little better now. That's basically the trade import patterns from across the world, and it's a speculative view. It is my impression of what the current major trade patterns within or involving Europe primarily would be. I've done 1 hour going across Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is an area I'm not really so familiar with the amount of trade, and I think that really does need looking at in more depth, but it needs people with a better regional focus than me, or team involvement, let's call it. Also to focus on these trade patterns here for, let's say, imports to Europe are very recent. So what I would say is that Chile was a very major player for imports to the pet trade of tarantulas until only very recently, about 5 or so years ago, the laws relating to pet trade collection and export changed radically, and essentially it closed to export for the tarantula pet trade. Before that, Peru was quite a big exporter. That also as far as I'm aware, closed for legal pet trade imports. There's also before that been extensive imports from Paraguay, Argentina, and I'd say Brazil as well. Brazil is still somewhat of a player. I've got an arrow here coming from southern Brazil and Uruguay. We still see imports from the pet trade from those to some degree. And as far as I'm aware, neither of those countries allow legal pet trade exports. So these are mostly legal imports I'm showing here, but there's some others going on, and I'd say pretty much every country is involved for other imports, legal or otherwise. Then just hopefully to move on, there we go, with an orange towards the left, I'm showing North America plays some role. I'm linking Canada and the USA together in that, but North America makes some exports to Europe and exports to Southeast Asia primarily, as far as I'm seeing the data. And recently, in the last couple of years, Mexico has also grown in number of exports. So hopefully in the next couple of days, people talk about the Mexican trade, particularly related to legal exports, which are only recently coming from Mexico. And where they're going is as a subject that needs to be clarified in terms of numbers and distribution. So my machine's playing up a little bit again, but then in red, what I want to say is that Europe is actually a major exporter of tarantulas. So the map was originally wrong for Spain, with only one native tarantula in the far south of the country. But in Europe primarily, there's a lot of trade and a lot of export going on for tarantulas which have been imported from worldwide. And it's mostly due to captive breeding, I would say, before export. The tarantula hobby is expanding in many places outside Europe. It's been long established in Europe, but it's rapidly growing in many other countries. So I'm having trouble to move on again. I was trying to use a free software here for doing a presentation rather than the commercial ones, and I'm learning my lesson. Sorry, I'm stopping to share and restarting that.
Yeah, well, don't worry. In your defense, we tried it yesterday and it was working. So maybe it's a connection or something, so don't worry.
It was, but I've also learned to not make my other slides as complex as those first three. So if I can get past them again. Right, that moves on essentially to a little focus on the New World, and I need to speed up a bit here. I want to say there is 1,000 or so described species of tarantulas worldwide, but the majority of those species, I'd say about 2/3, are from the New World, which essentially I mean Americas, from North America, South America. Recently, I'm pointing out on the top left is a book which has been conducted by many different authors, 500 pages, all you could want to know about New World tarantulas. So I'm sorry, shameless plug for that. I'm a co-author of one of the chapters. But it's a great book, and it goes into trade in depth by some other contributors. The map on the right is a general view for what's called Araneomorph spiders. They're essentially web building spiders. So it's a different group of spiders than the tarantulas, but it shows essentially the same pattern. What it is a distorted geographic map to show where the most species are found naturally. And so there we've got Brazil as being a country with a high number of species here for Araneomorph spiders. But down this lower section here, I've got the actual data for tarantulas. So tarantulas, 188 described species of Brazilian tarantulas. Mexico also high number of species, high endemicity, even 101. But what I want to focus on there is that some countries in yellow here, which some are geographically small, others are geographically large, but they have very few number of described spiders in general, very few described tarantulas. So we've got a great difference between countries, and I'm focused on Central America. We have some countries, Panama and Costa Rica in particular, with quite a high diversity of species, which are about 30 species or so. If I can find them on the chart, 35 species versus 18 species for those two countries. But then neighboring countries where there's very few species, so 2 tarantulas from Honduras, 2 described from Nicaragua. And that's generally due to the intensity of effort. But hopefully that becomes apparent why I want to mention that.
12 minutes, Stuart.
Okay, so I do have to be quicker. Right, so I'm doing my talk in two parts. So that was essentially on some trade patterns in general, but the dominant pressures, I would say, have concerns for sustainability. Here I'm just presenting some data from Carol herself and Pedro also, who organised this talk, and thank you to them for letting me share. What they've done recently and presented a congress of arachnology is to show a survey of generally interested parties in spiders and tarantulas in general. So this survey is 686 people who responded. A large percentage of those here would be determined in their categories as pet shop owners, so 62%. No. Okay, the other part is just to break down. One of their data aspects was I noticed that they show from their respondents, almost half had less than 5 years in the pet hobby, others significantly longer. The second point I wanted to pick up on was the number of tarantulas that many of those were keeping as pets or had in collections. About a third of them had 0 to 2, and a large fraction had 1. So to me, a third or even half had less than 10 tarantulas. So what I did was I took their same data, but I wanted to look at that myself in a slightly different way. So I've conducted a brief survey on Facebook before Christmas or over Christmas time when there was a lot of people around. And I basically got 200 people in the USA and North America to respond to a couple of questions. And this was a map I made of where those 200 respondents come from. This light color where I had no response, then slightly more response, slightly greater response, and then there's 3 states where I had greater than 10 respondents, but that was still less than 20 from those. The point was it was a good distribution across the United States who were replying, so they're all across the board there. And what you can break it down to is I asked them about how many tarantulas they keep as pets, and it was just to reinforce the data from Pedro and Carol. And there's a clear decline, I would say. Almost 25% of my 200 people, 1 to 5, 25%, 6 to 10, or 11 to 15. So 25% fewer and fewer. There's a gradual decline throughout that. So 75% of those people I was asking, and it was perhaps the most vocal hobbyists on the largest Facebook group, less than 50 tarantulas each. So there I want to focus on another response that they gave, and that's just the same graph presented a slightly different way with groupings. I asked them essentially, what are the top 3 most traded tarantulas in the United States? And what I got from that was fairly consistent replies. And here we have a breakdown of the different species which they were seeing as being most traded in the hobby. I'm saying it's very subjective here, but the top 3, if we put them on the chart here, the top one here was coming from Nicaragua, the third one was coming from Nicaragua, the second one was coming from Guyana. Those are all countries really with very poor knowledge of the tarantula diversity in basic species numbers, let alone other data. I also want to point out that all the ones in green are species which are listed under CITES, various CITES protections. So that means there's some trade monitoring data on numbers that are being traded across the board. And
Stuart, please, 2 more minutes, please.
Okay, what also came to me was from the hobbyists is ethics are a question. So we saw lots of things about tarantula, lots of things about cheetahs and other animals which we have major ethical questions about. But the top left is an image of a tarantula in one of the major chain pet stores in the United States. And ethically, for many tarantula hobbyists, that would be very poor conditions. This was how the hobbyist improved it. This would be how they live in nature. These are tree-dwelling tarantulas, live in tree holes high off the ground. Another case then was somebody reported about a tarantula that they'd seen same conditions for several months. This container here is only about the same size as the spider. Now that's how those spiders are imported from Nicaragua in the wild. but to keep it in the same conditions is pretty terrible in my opinion. This is how the hobbyists improve things with a burrow-like setup and much more space, water. This is how they live in the wild. And the thing is, these tarantulas live deep underground in these little circular burrows, and they only come out at night in general. So to give it a small container, strong light during the day, no respite, all those kind of things, I think we need to be looking at that. And then to emphasize the poor data for this second species, that second one I showed there was from Nicaragua. This is a map I've done for the species distribution. That's based on a lot of recent data. The geographic range of that species is quite small relatively on a global scale. So about 2,000 miles or 4,000 kilometers, only in these western lowlands. That region is highly developed by agriculture and commercialization. So there's a lot of development going on there. Cultivation in brown and in pink shows destroyed ecosystems essentially. How are these spiders coping in the wild in those areas? So there's been no assessment, even though this one in particular is the third most traded species, and it's been in the trade since about the 1970s. So it's continually been exported from that time, from these regions which are potentially highly degraded. The poor scientific knowledge is reflected in this book from 2003, where this authority would write Guatemala question mark, Nicaragua question mark, etc., etc. How poor is the knowledge? Wikipedia is reflecting it by that's the distribution, which it absolutely isn't. But pet traders sometimes know. This is a book written by people with deep links to the pet trade, and back in 2003 they clearly knew it had a Pacific lowland distribution like this. My talk was two parts. This is the first part, and maybe I don't have time for the second, but at least that part's done. I want to focus on the sustainability. So really, we're talking about legalities, but also sustainability for these. The large fraction of the tarantula trade, I would say, has been unsustainable. How many of these in captivity are dying? How many of these are actually reproducing? I'd say not many. And it's the chain stores which I look at as the question for sustainability. Many of these are bought by novices. Where are they getting the advice from? How and where for active beneficial keeping of these species? For sustainability, there's two other issues which I'm not going into. The food trade in Southeast Asia could be a big thing, particularly Cambodia, where there's a large number of tarantulas being caught as a food source. But now, more recently, they're exported worldwide. You get things like edible tarantula in a tin. So what's the impact of that to the few species which are affected? And same with the dry trade. So some people like a pinned dried tarantula as a display device. Again, Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia. What I want to say was there's better ways of doing it. There's tarantula molts. So this is a positive way. Spiders shed their skins annually when they're adult, and you can generally use those as display, which are equally good, arguably, without having to kill the spider. So Carol, are you going to give me a couple more minutes, or how do you want to...
Please conclude, because yeah, we are running out of time. Like, it breaks my heart because I'm super interested, of course, but if you can conclude in 1 minute, sorry.
Okay, lovely. No, 1 minute would be great. The other part was to talk about legalities, and really I did want to circumvent this because I don't want to get into legalities. I think we've had some great talks so far. The previous two talks have focused on this well with internet trade and what's going on. But for tarantulas in general, just to summarize then, what I want to look at was the fraction here of the people with the larger tarantula collections. They're generally the ones who are trading the animals, so they're supplying the pet trade to the other keepers who have smaller and often growing collections. And it's also these people with the larger collections, as well as being often the suppliers, they're the ones with the greatest knowledge in terms of ethics, husbandry, breeding tips, these kind of things. And there should be a feed down of information. There's generally not, and with the community, I'm often seeing a lot of information going on, exchange between people with small collections, and this sometimes an unhappy discord, let's call it. So for tarantula trade, I think we need to look at in terms of legalities and other aspects, is these people with the larger collections as well as the traders, the trader breeds they potentially call themselves, could they be called influencers? So then just skipping through the last ones, I think there's a couple of areas. So this is basically show that some of those people make great efforts to go to the wild and gather data. So this is one colleague of mine who went on a trip through Central America and luckily hooked up with a Costa Rican student who was working on a bachelor's project, and they were allowed to legally collect some spiders in Guatemala. But otherwise, he just photographed and recorded data throughout his trip. And later on, myself and others have built on that now to get an accurate distribution map of the species, densities, and other reliable data we can use as a foundation. Other areas are taxonomy. So some of these advanced hobbyists have great setup skills training, even though some of them don't have any formal training or quite basic formal training. And they come up with these wonderful pictures, wonderful discussions online about detailed characters, detailed drawings. These kind of things are all advancing. Even 20 years ago, SEM images. So there's great contribution there. For an active debate, I would say an example, these three have come into the pet trade, all traders one particular species, but hobbyists have been fundamental to help elucidate that this top one, for example, is actually a different species from this second and this third traded species. So this is from one hobbyist who then looked at the genitalia, working it out and discussing it online.
Stuart, please conclude. Sorry.
Okay, lovely. So the other points I just want to do was contribution to ecology. I'll just put the slide up, but it's publication of data that's the important part here. So some of them are gathering data, publishing data, and we have questions of reliability of journal and style and quality, but also online content is becoming increasingly prevalent. The big question there would be the permanency of the record. And so example, DVDs and videos, but how permanent are YouTube videos, which are super valuable information. Education as well. This is the last slide. This is just some examples of great contributions I think various people have made to our knowledge of tarantulas, and most of it has been doing from a non-professional background. More recently,